Greetings, everyone. We're going to shut the door and lock you in so you can have to be in my Bible class. Well, we're glad to have you here today, and we're going to start our Bible class. I got a lot of material to cover in just a few minutes of time, and so we'll get going here quickly as it can. I want to start off by reading a text, or rather an email that I got from one of our missionaries in Ukraine. This is one that's named Edward. We've been supporting him for a number of years. He is in the war zone. We had not heard from him for weeks, but then this morning I got an email from him. And I had sent him an email earlier asking, how you doing? Where are you? And so here's what he replied. He said, and this is from Edward, we have only one shelter at home, only a basement. This is when the rockets and bombs fly. And this happens every 10 to 15 seconds. Sometimes when it's quiet, you can sleep. We didn't go anywhere. We stayed and trusted the Lord. What he means not going anywhere, they haven't left town. They've stayed in their community. If we stay alive, praise God. And then he sent a bunch of photos, and the photos are of his family, his wife, his children. It shows a picture. I know you can't see this, but it shows a picture of his basement, how to get to it, down these steps. It shows where they've been staying inside the basement down in here. And so anyway, we're glad that he's still safe, and we're keeping him in our prayers. I emailed him back and said, thank you for the text, or rather his email. We're keeping him and all the others in our prayers too. Another of our missionaries have left that area, and he has gone all the way up to Germany now. And he's thinking about staying in Germany and preaching to the refugees from Ukraine that are now in that country. Another one we have is outside. He's left also the war zone, but he's still in Ukraine, just outside of Kyiv. So those are some of the missionaries that we have been keeping in track of. Edward did say, too, he's still receiving our contributions, our funds to him. So that's good to see that he's getting that. So that's just a little update on some of the missionary work that's going on there. Well, today we're going to be looking at Zephaniah. Don't know if you know much about Zephaniah, but hopefully today you will appreciate this great prophet. And he had a very difficult task and a sermon to preach, one that I wouldn't want to be in his shoes to go out and teach this to the people, but thankfully we have people like him that can do that and will do that. Before we go into Zephaniah, I want to read a text that's tied to this, but it's not from Zephaniah, it's from Exodus chapter 34. And let's see, I think I put that on the screen too. No, I didn't. So we just I'm going to read, I did put it on there. I just now remembered. But this is a chart that we've been looking at through the weeks. And if you see in red, there's Zephaniah in the time of where he lived. If you notice here, he's in the same area or time of Habakkuk, which we studied last week. And then he's also a contemporary of Jeremiah. So Jeremiah, Habakkuk, Zephaniah probably knew each other. And he's prophesying right at the end of the Assyrian Empire before the Babylonians conquered them. He's also after the Israel nation had been destroyed or taken away by the Assyrians. The Judah is still in existence. So here's the passage I want to read before we get into the prophet himself. This is when Moses was up on the mountain of Sinai getting the 10 Commandments and other laws that God was giving. And God comes down to Moses from the midst of the cloud. He comes before him and proclaims to Moses, the Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands, and forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. Yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. I want you to notice something about this phrase. First of all, not only is he compassionate and abounding in love, faithfulness, and forgiving, but he's slow to anger. I want us to remember that as we go through Zephaniah, because by the time Zephaniah comes on the scene, about 500 years of rebellion has been taking place in Judah and Israel. People were now had left him. They'd gone to idol worship. They've been treating each other evil, not obeying God's commands. 500 years, God has been warning these people and begging the people to come back to me, come back to me. If you don't, consequences are going to happen. And so slow to anger is finally beginning to get to its end. God is very patient. And then he says, but he will not leave the guilty unpunished. And that's what Zephaniah is going to be talking about. God will not leave the guilty unpunished. So let's begin by looking at Zephaniah chapter 1, verse 1. And there's some really interesting things that Zephaniah is going to say throughout his letter or his sermon that he preached to the Judah, the Jews living in Judah, and then he wrote these words down. So it says here, the word of the Lord came to Zephaniah, son of Cushi, the son of Gedaliah, the son of Amariah, the son of Hezekiah, during the reign of Josiah. These people like to have the ayahs, don't they? The son of Ammon and the king of Judah. So let's look at, first of all, a few things that he says in his introduction. This is Zephaniah, and if you look on the screen, you see that Zephaniah's name means Jehovah has hidden him. I don't know why his mother or father gave him that name, but that's the meaning behind the name Zephaniah. And it's also, he goes in more detail about his ancestry than the other prophets do. He tells that he's the son of Cushi, the son of Gedaliah, the son of Amariah, the son of Hezekiah. And if you go back into Bible history, Hezekiah was a king of Judah. And also, about this time would be when Hezekiah, he says he's the ancestor of, is his ancestor, is about the time when King Hezekiah was on the throne. There probably were other Hezekiahs by that name, but he may have been the great-grandson of the king. We just don't know for sure, but that is a possibility and probably a probability. And then we have during the days of Josiah. So he was preaching during the days of Josiah. Now this is interesting because you need to know something about this little king. Josiah became king when he was just 8 years old. His father was killed by an assassination. And he was his father was very evil. His grandfather, Josiah's grandfather, is also very evil. We'll look at that more later. And then we'll read about Josiah in 2 Kings chapter 22 and also through 23, 2 Chronicles 33 through 35. You can go back and read about his life in those areas. He was a good king, one of the rare good kings of the Judah nation. And when Josiah was 28 years old, he ordered that there be a restoration of the temple, which had been deteriorating through the years. So he said, let's spruce it up. Let's get that temple back in a good shape like it used to be. Well, during that sprucing up, the builders discovered the books of the law, which had been forgotten. And there was some crevice, maybe some cabinet, some closet or somewhere in the temple. They brought it out and thought, wow, here's the law written by Moses. And so they bring it before the king, and they read it to the king. And Josiah is he's now 28 years old, just is in anguish because he saw how far they had gone from worshiping God according to God's commandments and obeying keeping the law of other commandments of treating one another. And so he orders a complete restoration of the worship to God and following God's commandments to the people. By doing that, he had to destroy all the idols that were erected all around Judah. And so he has that to be done. So all these idols in Judah were destroyed, and he ordered the people to go back and follow God. The problem was not all the people were going back to follow God, even though that's what he ordered. So Zephaniah's prophecy probably came before this restoration, while the Israelites were still worshiping idols, and before this great restoration took place. Because of what Zephaniah says, the people were so wicked and evil that probably this had been taking place before Josiah became king. So let's go back to our chart, and I put a blue line down the middle here. That's about the time we think that Zephaniah was doing his preaching, and then he wrote his letter, or one of the books of the Bible here. And as we see here, Zechariah lived around 612 BC, and the Assyrian Empire was destroyed, I would say 618, around 612 BC, so just a few years before the Assyrian Empire was destroyed. Now remember, the Assyrians had come into that area before and destroyed the northern nation. And so here we see that the Israelite nation, or the northern kingdom, was now gone by the time Zephaniah is on the scene. Only Judah, as you see, is still existing, that is among the God's people. So that's who Zephaniah is talking to, the Judah people, the Jews in that area. Here's the main message of Zephaniah. God is firmly in control. God has always been firmly in control, but the people needed to remember that even though you're going off on your evil ways and worshiping idols, that doesn't mean God has lost his power. He is firmly in control, and he will prove this by punishment upon the disobedient Judah and surrounding evil nations. But God will reestablish the kingdom of Judah after they've been punished. So that's what Zephaniah's main message is going to be about. So let's go now in chapter 1. We're going to read verses 20, chapter 2 through chapter 1, verse 2 through chapter 2, verse 3. And this is where God says he's going to punish Jerusalem and Judah for their evil ways and their idol worship if they don't turn around. Now, all of this is contingent. If the people would turn around and come back to God, God will not send the punishment. But if they don't turn around, here's what will happen. So this first section is focused on the country of Judah and the Jews. So here's what the Lord says to Zephaniah. I will sweep away everything from the face of the earth, declares the Lord. I will sweep away both men and animals. I will sweep away the birds of the air and the fish of the sea. The wicked have only heaps of rubble when I cut off man from the face of the earth, declares the Lord. So in other words, his wrath is so strong, it looks like God's going to wipe the whole world away, but this is what you call a hyperbole, which means an exaggerated point to make an exaggerated statement to make a point. He's making a point that, watch out, Judah, here it comes. And then this is what he goes on to say, verse 4. I will stretch out my hand against Judah and against all who live in Jerusalem. I will cut off from this place every remnant of Baal, the names and pagans of the idolatrous priests. Remember, Baal is one of those big idols and false gods that the people were worshiping. Those who bow down on the roofs and worship the starry host. Those who bow down and swear by the Lord, and those who swear by Moloch. That's another idol. Those who turn back and follow the Lord, and neither seek the Lord nor inquire of him. Be silent before the sovereign Lord, for the day of the Lord is near. He uses this day of the Lord quite often through this prophecy, and the day of the Lord means the judgment of God is coming. The Lord has prepared a sacrifice. He has consecrated those he has invited. On the day of the Lord's sacrifice, I will punish princesses and kings' sons and all those clad in foreign clothes. On the day of the Lord, I will punish those who avoid stepping on the threshold, who fill the temple of their gods with violence and deceit. I want to go back to look at verse, before I go any further. Moloch. You remember we just read about Moloch? And he said those who bow down to Moloch, the idol. Moloch was an idol back in the days of Judah. And one of the kings of Judah, Manasseh, would sacrifice his children upon the arms of this idol that would stuck out over a fire and lay their live babies on the arms to be burned to death. That was the idol of Moloch. And so in 2 Kings chapter 21, verse 6, it says that Manasseh, the king, had now been involved in this. And so now that's why God is saying that this evil practice is so bad, he just can't stand it. Here's the passage from 2 Kings chapter 21, 5 through 6. In the two courtyards of the Lord's temple, he, that is Manasseh, built altars for all the stars of the sky. He passed his son through the fire. And so there's the, that he's talking about sacrificing his son. And if you read the verses before that, he's talking about the Molochs, the idol. Now go to verse 9, I just read. Going back to Zephaniah chapter 1, verse 9. On that day I will punish those who avoid stepping on the threshold. Have you ever stepped on the threshold of a house or a building? Well, I never thought about it, but I guess I have. So why is he saying, I'm going to punish those who avoid stepping on the threshold? In other words, if you don't step on that threshold, I'm going to punish you. So what is he referring to there? Well, there is an answer for that in the scriptures. I will punish everyone who avoids stepping on the threshold. Goes all the way back to 1 Samuel chapter 5. This is about 430 years before Zephaniah. And here's the story behind it. This was before King Saul was a king, before Israel had a king. But there was a battle between the Israelites and the Philistines. The Israelites were not faring well in this battle. So they decided, let's get the Ark of the Covenant, which was made during the time of Moses crossing and the Israelites crossing the desert in the wilderness. Let's get that and we'll bring it to the battle area. We'll bring it to this land where we're fighting. And God will have to make us win now because the Ark of the Covenant is there. And if we lose, we're going to lose the Ark. So they bring the Ark of the Covenant to the battle. And God says, I'm not going to be your puppet. So he didn't let the Israelites win. He allowed the Philistines to win. And as a result, the Philistines captured the Ark of the Covenant and took it back to their kingdom and put it in the temple of their god called Dagon. Now, we have some, here's a picture of a remnant of the Philistines capturing the Ark, and they're taking it back to their country. Now, the Israelites were devastated that God allowed this to happen. Even Eli the prophet, when he heard about the Ark of the Covenant being captured, fell down and died. He was so upset about what happened. Here is Dagon. That has been covered by archaeologists, some inscription of what he looks like. Notice it's a head of a man, but he has the body of a fish. So that would be like a mermaid, only be a man-made, or what do you call them? And this is where we get the idea of, what is this guy, Neptune? No, Triton, the god of the ocean, and he looks like a fish and also a man. I guess if you see the Little Mermaid, that would be him in that thing too. But anyway, probably this is where that idea came from. Well, they put the ark in the temple with Dagon. They left him that night, left the temple that night, came back the next morning, and Dagon had fallen face forward in front of the ark. So the people in Philistine put him back up and set him back up went out the next night, spent the night, came back the next morning. This time, Dagon not only had fallen again before the ark, but his head fell off and his arms and his hands fell off, and they covered the threshold of the temple. And because they covered the threshold of the temple, the priest of Dagon stepped over the threshold and would not step on it. So it says here in 1 Samuel chapter 5, here's the scripture that talks about that. But when they rose, that is the priest of Dagon, early the next morning, behold, Dagon had fallen face down on the ground before the ark of the Lord, and the head of Dagon and both his hands were lying cut off from on the threshold. Only the trunk of Dagon left to him. This is why the priests of Dagon and all who enter the house of Dagon do not tread on the threshold of Dagon in Ashdod to this day. So now, anytime the priests went into their temple, they would step over the threshold and not step on it because the hands and head of their God had broken and fallen on it. Well, as a result of that, the Philistines decided they don't want this Ark of the Covenant in their country anymore, so they put it on a cart pulled by 2 oxen and sent it back to Israel. And that's how the Israelites got their ark back, the Ark of the Covenant back. But look at this timeline. This Ark of the was captured around 1050 BC. Zephaniah lived around 620 BC. And that's about 430 years that Zephaniah makes a reference back to this, stepping on the threshold. And what's the meaning is that those who worship idols, if you avoid the stepping on the threshold, is referring to anybody who worshiped idols, because that's what this was about. So going back to our passage in Zephaniah chapter 1, verse 9, it says, on that day I will punish all those avoid stepping on the threshold, means I am punishing all those who worship idols, is reference to that. So now you don't have to worry about stepping on a threshold because you're not worshiping idols. So if you go in your house and step on it, you wish you weren't worried about it?
Oh, I wish I weren't worshiping idols.
Oh, you wish you weren't. How are you worshiping idols, Tim?
Oh, try to make money.
Try to make money.
Have
Too much entertainment.
Eat too much. I got idols.
Eat too much. Oh, you got all those kind of idols. I guess we're all kind of guilty of some of that, aren't we? Yeah. But it's not like bow down and worshiping those kind of idols that they were doing intently. Well, let's go on to verse 10. We're now in Zephaniah chapter 1, verse 10, continuing God's threat to the Israelites, the Jews, if they don't straighten up. On that day, declares the Lord, a cry will go out from the fish gate. By the way, the fish gate is one of the gates of the temple, so that's what he's talking about. Wailing to the new quarter, and a loud crash from the hills. Wail, you who live in the market district, all you merchants that will be wiped out. All who trade with silver will be ruined. At that time I will search Jerusalem with lamps and punish those who are complacent, those who are like wine left on its dregs, who think the Lord will do nothing, neither good nor bad. Now that's the point right there. These Jews thought, God's not going to punish us. After all, we're the chosen people, and this is Jerusalem where the temple lives, exists. God's not going to let anybody come in and destroy Jerusalem and take over the temple. No, God would never do that. So that's why they were complacent. They were thinking, God's not going to do anything like that. Little did they know. Let's go to verse 13. Their wealth will be plundered, their houses demolished. They will build houses, but not live in them. They will plant vineyards, but not drink the wine. So, and then he goes on to say, the great day of the Lord, remember that means God's judgment, is near and coming quickly. Listen, the cry of the day of the Lord is the bitter and shouting of the warrior there. The day will be a day of wrath, the day of distress and anguish, a day of trouble and ruin, a day of darkness and gloom, a day of clouds and blackness, a day of trumpet and battle cry against the fortified cities, against the corner towers. I will bring distress on the people. They will walk like blind men because they have sinned against the Lord. Their blood will be poured out like dust, their entrails like filth. Neither their silver nor their gold will be able to save them on the day of the Lord's wrath. In the fire of his jealousy, and the whole world will be consumed, for he will make a sudden end of all who live in the earth. That again is another hyperbole, meaning that this destruction of Judah is going to be so bad it looks like the whole world is being destroyed. Going down to chapter 2, verse 1. Gather together, O shameful nation, before the appointed time arrives, and the day sweeps on like a chaff. Before the fierce anger of the Lord comes upon you, before the day of the Lord's wrath comes upon you, seek the Lord, all you humble in the land, you who do what he commands. Seek righteousness, seek humility. Perhaps he will shelter. You will be sheltered on the day of the Lord's anger. So here Zephaniah is begging these people, come back to him. Humble yourselves before the Lord. Don't let this come to you. And yet, although Zephaniah preached this, so did all the other prophets before him preach this to the people, come back to the Lord, they still kept on their evil ways. So on the day I will punish everyone who avoids stepping on the threshold. We just looked at that. Now let's go to chapter 2, starting with verse 4. God's wrath is not just against Judah, but also all the surrounding countries around Judah. So God's punishment to evil nations around Judah. So in verses 4 through 7 of chapter 2, God will punish Philistia for their evil ways and idol worship. Well, where is that country? There it is on the circle on the map. It's just west of Judah. So this is what God says about those people. And this is, by the way, if you go to the map, modern map, this is where Gaza is today in Palestine. And they even call it Gaza here. Gaza will be abandoned, and all of Ashkelon left in ruins. At midday, Ashdod will be emptied and Ekron uprooted. Woe to you who live by the sea, O Kerethoth people. The word of the Lord is against you, O Canaan, land of the Philistines. I will destroy you, and none will be left. The land by the sea where the Kerethites dwell will be the place of the shepherds and sheep pens. It will belong to the remnant of the house of Judah. There they will find pasture. In the evening they will lie down in the houses of Ashkelon, and the Lord their God will care for them, and they will restore their fortunes. So what he's saying here at the end of that is that the remnant of those Jews who are good and humble that don't get the punishment, they're going to take over your land instead of you having it. Then God goes to the next country. God will punish Moab and Ammon for their evil ways and idol worship. Where there's Ammon and there's Moab that he's going to punish next. What do you remember about Moab? You remember what famous Bible character came out of Moab? Somebody said it. Ruth, that's right. Ruth came out of Moab. You remember that when the time of before David, his great-grandmother, I think it was, if I got it correct, there was a famine in the land. They went to Moab in order to find food and to live, and there Ruth married one of the children and came back with her mother Naomi back to Judah. Well, she was from Moab, but unfortunately, by 600 years later, Moab had turned into an evil country, and now God's going to show his wrath against them. Let's look at, excuse me? That's about like where that country today would be not Iraq, but Jordan. That's where Jordan is today. Okay, so we're going now to Zephaniah chapter 2, verse 8. I have heard the insults of Moab and the taunts of the Ammonites. who have assaulted my people and have threats against their land. Therefore, as surely as I live, declares the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, surely Moab will become like Sodom and the Ammonites like Gomorrah. What happened to Sodom and Gomorrah? You know that story. They would burn down to nothing. A place of weeds and salt pits, of wasteland forever. The remnants of my people will plunder them. The survivors of my nation will inherit their land. This is what they will get in return for their pride, for insulting and mocking the people of the Lord Almighty. The Lord will be awesome to them when he destroys all the gods of the land. The nations of every shore will worship him, every one in his own land. So now he has his punishment against those two countries. The next he lists is Cush. Now Cush is interesting because look at where it's located. It's in the upper regions of the Nile, south of Egypt. Now his wrath is going toward those people. Now why would God be against the ancient country of Cush, which today would be Sudan and Ethiopia is where that is countries today? Well, apparently some Jews had lived there. There's an ancient teachings that a lot of Jews migrated down to this area and lived, and they were now going into idol worship. So possibly that could be the answer. But look what he says now, starting verse 12. You too, O Cushites, will be slain by my sword. And that's it. That's all he says about the Cushites. You are not going to escape this. Next, he goes to Assyria. Now remember, Assyria was that country that came in and captured the northern kingdom and expanded their land, but they could not capture Jerusalem, therefore Judah was spared. So the next firing against the foreign country is going to be against Assyria. So in verse 13 of chapter 2, he says, he will stretch out his hand against the north and destroy Assyria, leaving Nineveh utterly desolate and dry as a desert. The flocks and herds will lie down there, creatures of every kind. The desert owl and the screech owl will roost in their columns. Their calls will echo through the windows. Rubble will be in the doorways. The beams of cedar will be exposed. This is the carefree city that lives in safety. She says to herself, I am, and there is none beside me. In other words, a lot of pride. What a ruin she has become, a lair for wild beasts. All who pass by her scoff and shake their fists. So here we see the destruction of Assyria. Vivid, yeah, very, very vivid one. Yes, John. Now notice in a circle on our map, there's a little bitty town or country called Babylon or area. While Assyria was focusing their attention toward other conquest, little did they know that a east part of their country, there was coming a rise of another of the people that they didn't pay attention to, and that was Babylon. And they became so strong they conquered their own country, the Assyrians that had conquered them. Now Babylon now becomes the country that captures Assyria. So here Zephaniah preaches against the Assyrians, saying that they're going to be destroyed. Babylon comes in and does destroy them around 612 BC. And so what Zephaniah said is going to happen actually did happen. And so now Assyria is destroyed and out of the picture. Then let's go to chapter 3, verses 1 through 8. Now God summarizes all this prophecy about punishing Judah and the surrounding countries. So we read down to verse 8. Woe to the city of oppressors, rebellious and defiled. She obeys no one. She accepts no correction. She does not trust in the Lord. She does not draw near to her God. Her officials are roaring lions. Their rulers are evening wolves who leave nothing for the morning. Her prophets are arrogant. They are treacherous men. Her priests profane the sanctuary and do violence to the law. The Lord within her righteous, he does no wrong. excuse me, the Lord within her is righteous. He does no wrong. Morning by morning he dispenses his justice, and every new day he does not fail. Yet the unrighteous know no shame. I have cut off nations. This is what God says. I have cut off nations. Their thresholds are demolished. I have left their streets deserted. There is no one passing through. Their cities are destroyed. No one will be left, no one at all. I said to the city, surely you will fear me and accept correction. So in other words, he's saying, certainly you will come to me, God says. Certainly you've seen the destructions I can do. Come back to me. Then her dwelling will not be cut off. All of my punishments come upon her, but they were still eager to act corruptly in all they did. So even after he begged them to turn around, they still wouldn't listen. Verse 8, therefore wait for me, declares the Lord, for the day I will stand to testify. I have decided to assemble the nations, to gather the kingdoms, to pour out my wrath on them, all my fierce anger. The whole world will be consumed by fire of my jealous anger. Now we got to remember about God's anger. God doesn't have any emotional anger like we do. He has a just anger, a just wrath, you might call it. It's a wrath that is controlled. He's not out of control. Sometimes when we get mad, we can get out of control in our anger and do stupid things that we shouldn't have never done. God never does that kind of anger. His wrath is always in control and always exactly what it needs to be, no more and no less. And so that's when we think about God's wrath, it's a controlled wrath, but it's a wrath that is one side of God that we don't want to be on. So now let's go to, here we see the Jews were finally captured by the Babylonians and taken out of their country and taken back up to Babylonian. So what God said happened to Jerusalem and destruction of the temple happened because they would not repent. Here is a map of Babylon. And finally, they took over Assyria. And notice how far south Babylon goes, all the way down to Cush, that southern country just south of Egypt that God said will be punished. The Babylonians went all the way down there and captured that land as well as the rest of the land that we see here. So that's where they were taken, the Jews. That's right.
He went to Jerusalem because of the feast and whatnot, and he had to study. He read the scripture and didn't understand what the Lord was saying.
Mm-hmm.
And, I never understood why they were Ethiopian.
Good point. So for those at home listening, Tim was just bringing out a very good point. In Acts chapter 8, there's a story of the Ethiopian eunuch. Well, where's the Ethiopian eunuch from? Cush. I'll back up to our map here. He was from this southern area. When finally, centuries later, when Jesus came on the scene and then finally went to the cross and then was resurrected. Oh no, I heard that, so I'm going to have to brush. So anyway, Tim was bringing out that now that makes sense. That why would an Ethiopian eunuch, being Jew, come all the way up to Jerusalem to worship? Well, there was an area where the Ethiopians were proselytized by probably the people of Judah who had come to this area, and then later God punished them for their evil ways. That's right. That's exactly right, Bobby. Thank you. So for those of you at home, what Bobby's pointing out is that because the Jews were taken captive, those who were left behind had to set up a place of worship. The Jerusalem was gone. They couldn't go back. The temple was gone. So they set up in their areas synagogues where the Jews would worship, which spread the Jewish teachings, well, God's teaching, I should really say, to the people around in their area. And that was how synagogues came about in existence. Okay, so this little map chart here shows that the Israelites, the Jews were taken captive. For 70 years they were in Babylon, and then finally they came out. I don't have time to read the rest of the chapter of Zephaniah, but what ends up saying, God will reestablish Jerusalem and Judah, and they will get to go back to their land. That's what the end of Zephaniah is talking about. So he ends on a positive note, which I don't have time to read. But he ends on a nice note that even though I punished you people, I will restore you. I will bring you back. So here's a picture of the Jews coming out of Babylon and going back home. Now, it wasn't because the Babylonians let them go. It was the next country, and that was the Medes and Persians who conquered Babylonia, and they let the Jews go back home. So ending our lesson today, let's go back to Exodus 34. Remember, we read that at the beginning. The Lord is slow to anger. Remember, he had been patient all this time, but now his patience has come to an end, and he will not leave the guilty unpunished. God didn't want to punish his people, but they left him no choice, and that's what happened here. Well, next week we're going to look at Obadiah. Now, Obadiah is quite a different prophet than what we've been looking at. He doesn't prophesy to Judah. His oracle is against Edom. Now, when you see this next time, there's Edom. So when we read about Obadiah, he's going to talk about this country, which the other prophets did not discuss. And so and that's a really short book about God's vengeance on Edom for their evil ways. And what Edom did, by the way, I'll just go ahead and give you a spoiler alert. When Judah was captured or was being punished by God, the people of Edom celebrated. They said, "Yay, Judah's being destroyed. We like that, yay." God did not like that being done by the Edomites. And so now Obadiah is going to say to them, here's what God's going to do to you, because you're evil too. Oh, and then one other point about, let me go back to our chart. I put Obadiah here on our chart, but a lot of scholars don't know exactly when Obadiah lived. He could have lived here, but he could have lived just about anywhere on this chart before the capture of Judah. So we're not sure of his date, but most or a lot of people put him close to the destruction of Judah. So that's it. Appreciate the comments that you had made. Anybody else have one last statement you want to make before we close? Okay, thank you, Mark. Talking about how God punishes the people from the generation to generation to generation. Those generations that come later were evil too, but he allows them to die off. Mark was talking about until the good could finally come back and be restored in the area. Is that what you're talking about? Yes. Okay. Thank you, everyone.